Imagine food that stays perfectly edible for 50 years. No refrigerator, no freezer, no preservatives, no canning jar with a rubber seal, just meat, fat, and knowledge passed down through generations. For millennia, Native American nations across this continent solved one of humanity's greatest challenges: how to preserve food in every climate imaginable. Scorching deserts where heat spoils meat in hours. Frozen tundras where winter never seems to end. Humid forests where mold destroys everything. Windswept plains where you might travel for weeks between food sources. Each environment presented its own deadly puzzle, and each nation developed ingenious solutions that kept their people alive and thriving. We're about to explore those solutions. You'll discover pemmican, a superfood so effective that Arctic explorers depended on it more than any modern ration. We'll travel to the Pacific Northwest, where nations turned overwhelming salmon runs into year-round security through smoking techniques that rival anything we do today. We'll go deep into the Southwest deserts, where people built underground storage systems that kept corn fresh for years in blistering heat. We'll journey to the Arctic, where the Inuit and Yup'ik people developed preservation methods so counterintuitive, so brilliant, that they seemed impossible to outsiders. And we'll discover the portable foods that allowed people to travel vast distances, trade across thousands of miles, and maintain connections across an entire continent. This isn't just history. These techniques represent thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and refinement. They're solutions we've largely forgotten in our age of refrigeration and supermarkets. And they're a testament to human ingenuity when survival depends on getting it right. Let's start with perhaps the most legendary preserved food ever created. In the 1800s, European fur traders and explorers pushed deep into the northern plains and the Canadian wilderness. They brought their own food: salted pork, hardtack, dried beans, standard fare for long expeditions. But they quickly discovered something that changed everything. The Cree, the Métis, the Blackfoot, the Lakota, they had something better. Something that made European provisions look primitive by comparison. They called it pemmican, and it was unlike anything the newcomers had ever seen. Pemmican wasn't just preserved meat. It was engineered nutrition. A pound of pemmican packed more calories than a pound of any European trail food. It didn't spoil. It didn't need cooking. You could eat it cold in a blizzard or mix it into a stew when you had time for a fire. Explorers discovered bags of pemmican that had been stored for decades, and it was still perfectly edible. Some records from the fur trade mention pemmican lasting 50 years or more without refrigeration. 50 years. Think about that for a moment. We struggle to keep meat fresh for a week in our refrigerators. They created food that outlasted most human lifespans. So what was pemmican, and how did it achieve something that seems almost impossible? The process started with lean meat, usually buffalo on the Great Plains, but caribou, deer, elk, or moose in other regions. The key was selecting the leanest cuts possible. Fat would be added later in a specific way, but the meat itself needed to be as lean as you could make it. According to accounts from fur traders and early ethnographers, among the Cree and Métis, this was primarily the domain of skilled women who had learned the craft from their mothers and grandmothers. These experts would slice the meat into very thin strips. Thickness mattered. Too thick and the inside wouldn't dry completely, leaving moisture that would eventually cause rot. Too thin and you'd lose too much of the meat to the drying process. These strips were then draped over wooden racks, usually set up near the camp where people could keep an eye on them. In the plains, the process often happened in late summer or early fall. When the buffalo were fat and healthy, the meat would dry in the sun and wind for several days. Some nations would also use light smoke, not to cook the meat, but to keep flies away and add a slight preservative quality. The goal was complete moisture removal. And I mean complete. The meat had to become brittle, almost like wood. You could snap it with your fingers. This level of dryness is what made long-term storage possible. Bacteria needs moisture to grow. No moisture, no bacterial growth, no spoilage. But here's where pemmican diverged from simple jerky. Dried meat alone was valuable, and we'll talk more about jerky later. But it wasn't pemmican. The Cree, Métis, and other Plains nations took it several steps further. Once the meat was completely dried, it was pounded. Not just broken up, but pulverized into an almost powder-like consistency. Lakota women, renowned for their meat processing skills, would use smooth stones or wooden tools to pound the dried meat over and over until it became fine shreds, almost fluffy in texture. This pounding could take hours of repetitive work. It was labor-intensive, but it was essential. The powdered texture allowed the meat to mix thoroughly with what came next: fat. Fat is what transformed dried meat into pemmican, but not just any fat and not added in any way. This was precise food science developed over centuries of refinement. The fat came from rendering. Among the Blackfoot, Cree, and other buffalo hunting nations, specialists would take the fat from buffalo, particularly the highly prized back fat and organ fat, and heat it slowly in containers or over fires. As it heated, the pure liquid fat separated from any tissue or impurities. This liquid fat, called tallow when it came from buffalo or beef, was the goal. The rendering process was crucial. The fat had to be pure. Any meat scraps or impurities left in the tallow could introduce moisture or spoilage. So it was carefully strained, often through woven materials or naturally porous materials, until what remained was clear, pure liquid fat. Then came the mixing. While the rendered fat was still warm and liquid, it was poured over the pounded dried meat. The ratio mattered enormously. Too much fat and the pemmican would be greasy and less stable. Too little and it would be dry and crumbly, losing some of its nutritional density and preservation qualities. The ideal ratio was roughly equal parts fat to meat by weight, about 50-50, though this varied somewhat by region and intended use. As the fat mixed into the powdered meat, something remarkable happened. The meat absorbed the fat completely. The two became one substance, no longer separate meat and fat, but a unified, dense, slightly oily mixture. As it cooled, the fat solidified, creating a matrix that locked the meat fibers in place and created an oxygen barrier around every particle of protein. This is what made pemmican nearly indestructible. The fat didn't just add calories, though it added plenty, roughly 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 for protein. It created a protective seal. Oxygen couldn't reach the meat to cause oxidation. Moisture couldn't get in to allow bacterial growth. The pemmican was essentially locked in time. Basic pemmican was meat and fat. But many nations created variations that added flavor, nutrition, and variety to their winter diet. Dried berries were the most common addition. Choke cherries, Saskatoon berries, cranberries, blueberries, whatever was available in the region. These berries would be dried separately, sometimes mashed into a paste, and then mixed into the pemmican during the final stages. The berries added natural sugars for quick energy, vitamins that helped prevent scurvy during long winters, and a tartness that cut through the richness of the fat. Some variations included dried roots or other plant materials, though this was less common. The goal was always long-term stability, and anything with too much moisture or sugars that could ferment was avoided. The Métis people, who emerged from unions between European fur traders and First Nations women, became legendary for their pemmican production. They produced it at an industrial scale for the fur trade, creating thousands of pounds each year. Métis pemmican fed the voyageurs, the fur traders who paddled canoes across immense distances through the Canadian wilderness. A voyageur might carry nothing but pemmican for months at a time. Records from trading posts show just how valuable this was. A 90-pound bag of pemmican, called a taureau, could feed a working man for a month or more. It never spoiled in the canoe, even in summer heat or driving rain. It didn't need to be cooked, saving time and eliminating the need for fires that might give away your position in hostile territory. You could eat it on the move, paddle all day, make camp in darkness, and be ready to leave at dawn. Once made, pemmican was packed for storage. The most traditional method used by Plains nations was raw hide bags called parfleche. These were made from buffalo hide that had been dehaired, stretched, and dried until it was stiff and durable. The bags were often decorated with beautiful geometric patterns painted with natural pigments. The pemmican was packed tightly into these bags while still slightly warm. As it cooled completely, it formed a solid mass. The bags were then sealed, sometimes sewn shut, sometimes just folded and tied, and stored in cool, dry places. On the plains, this might mean elevated platforms to keep them away from animals and ground moisture. In forested areas, they might be hung from trees or stored in specially constructed caches. The fat content was what made the long-term storage possible. Fat doesn't support bacterial growth the way protein or carbohydrates do. And because the fat formed a complete barrier around the meat particles, oxygen couldn't cause rancidity. As long as the pemmican stayed dry and relatively cool, it would last indefinitely. How long is indefinitely? Fur trading records document pemmican being stored for 10, 20, even 30 years and remaining edible. Some accounts mention pemmican from the early 1800s still being consumed in the 1850s with no ill effects. In controlled conditions, truly dry, truly cool, pemmican could theoretically last 50 years or more. Compare that to modern survival foods. Freeze-dried camping meals are typically rated for 5 to 7 years. MREs, the military's standard field ration, are considered safe for maybe 5 years under ideal conditions, though the quality degrades long before that. Even canned goods, sealed in metal with all modern food science behind them, are generally rated for 2 to 5 years. Pemmican outlasted all of them, made with nothing but meat, fat, and knowledge. Modern nutritional analysis reveals just how well-designed pemmican was. A pound of pemmican contains roughly 3,000 to 3,500 calories, depending on the exact fat ratio. That's more calorie-dense than almost any other traditional food. For people living in harsh climates, doing physical labor, and often facing food scarcity, calorie density was everything. You could only carry so much weight. You could only store so much volume. Pemmican gave you maximum energy in minimum space. The protein content was substantial, around 40 to 50% by weight. This provided the amino acids needed for muscle maintenance and repair, crucial for people who traveled on foot for miles every day, who hunted, who built shelters, who worked physically from dawn to dusk. The fat content, 50 to 60%, supplied steady, long-burning energy. Fat is the most efficient fuel for the human body during sustained activity. It doesn't cause blood sugar spikes and crashes the way carbohydrates do. For people who might travel all day or hunt for hours in sub-zero temperatures, fat was the ideal fuel. When berries were added, the pemmican gained vitamin C, which prevented scurvy, a potentially fatal disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy plagued European explorers who relied on preserved foods without fresh fruits or vegetables. Native nations that included berries in their pemmican didn't face this problem. The food was also remarkably complete. While not perfectly balanced by modern nutritional standards, pemmican provided protein, fat, some carbohydrates from berries, and essential vitamins. You could survive on pemmican alone for extended periods without major nutritional deficiencies. Many fur traders did exactly that. Pemmican was most associated with the Plains nations, the groups who had access to massive buffalo herds and the wide open spaces needed for large-scale drying operations. The Cree people, who ranged across what's now central Canada, were master pemmican makers. They traded it extensively, and their pemmican was highly prized for its quality. The Métis, with Cree heritage and knowledge, scaled up production to supply the entire fur trade network. Métis women in particular became renowned across the fur trade as expert pemmican producers, whose product was considered the gold standard. The Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations produced pemmican as a staple food. Their territory across the northern Great Plains gave them access to enormous buffalo herds. Blackfoot pemmican fed families through winters that could last 6 months or more. The Lakota people, the powerful Sioux nation of the Great Plains, created pemmican as part of their sophisticated buffalo-based economy. After a successful hunt, Lakota communities would spend days processing hundreds of pounds of meat into pemmican, jerky, and other preserved forms. This work was essential to survival. The hunters provided the raw materials, but the preservation specialists were what kept the nation alive through winter. Further north, the Dean people, various Athabascan groups spread across the northern forests and tundra, made pemmican from caribou. The principles were identical, but caribou fat has a slightly different consistency than buffalo fat, requiring small adjustments in technique. Even some coastal nations made pemmican-like foods. The principle of mixing dried protein with rendered fat appeared in different forms across the continent. If you had access to meat and fat, and you needed food that lasted, you eventually arrived at something like pemmican. Pemmican became so economically important that it sparked actual conflict. In the early 1800s, tensions between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, rival fur trading corporations, exploded into violence over pemmican supplies. The Northwest Company depended on Métis pemmican to feed their voyageurs. Without it, their entire trade network would collapse. When the Hudson's Bay Company, backed by Scottish settlers in the Red River area, tried to restrict pemmican exports from the region, the Northwest Company saw it as an existential threat. In 1816, this tension erupted into the Battle of Seven Oaks, where Métis fighters killed the governor of the Red River Colony and 20 of his men. The conflict, known as the Pemmican War, showed just how vital this preserved food had become to the economic structure of North America. Empires fought over it. The systematic slaughter of buffalo in the late 1800s didn't just destroy herds, it destroyed entire food systems. Pemmican production depended on access to buffalo. When the buffalo disappeared, deliberately exterminated as a strategy to force Plains nations onto reservations, pemmican largely disappeared with them. By the 1880s, an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 animals. The massive hunts that had sustained pemmican production for thousands of years became impossible. The knowledge remained, but the resources didn't. Some nations switched to beef when cattle became available, but it wasn't the same. Beef fat has a different composition than buffalo fat. The flavor changed, and perhaps more importantly, the entire system changed. Buffalo had been communal resources, hunted as needed. Cattle belonged to individuals or to the government. The economic and social structure that had supported pemmican making for millennia was broken. Today, pemmican is experiencing a revival. Survival enthusiasts, hunters, and people interested in traditional foods have rediscovered its remarkable properties. You can find modern pemmican recipes online, YouTube videos showing the process, and even commercial pemmican for sale. Some native nations are reclaiming pemmican making as part of cultural preservation efforts. Teaching young people how to make pemmican isn't just about food, it's about maintaining connection to ancestors, to traditional knowledge, to a way of life that sustained people for thousands of years. The modern paleo diet movement has embraced pemmican as the ultimate ancestral superfood, low in carbohydrates, high in healthy fats and protein, shelf-stable without processing. It checks every box for people seeking to eat like their ancestors. Ultralight backpackers prize it for its calorie density. Like when you're trying to carry everything you need for a week-long hike, pemmican's 3,500 calories per pound is hard to beat. No modern freeze-dried meal comes close. Preppers, people preparing for emergencies or societal disruptions, have added pemmican to their storage supplies. In a genuine survival scenario where refrigeration fails, pemmican's decade-spanning shelf life becomes invaluable. But beyond these modern applications, pemmican represents something profound. Human beings observing their environment, experimenting with solutions, and refining those solutions over generations until they achieved something remarkable. They created food that defied time itself, using nothing but materials at hand and accumulated wisdom. When we think about pemmican, it's easy to focus on the end product, the nearly immortal food, the calorie density, the nutritional completeness. But the real achievement was the knowledge system that created it. Someone thousands of years ago noticed that fully dried meat lasted longer than partially dried meat. Someone else noticed that fat didn't spoil the same way meat did. Another person tried mixing the two and discovered they worked better together. Generations refined the ratios. They tested different drying times. They discovered which cuts of meat worked best. They learned how to render fat properly. They figured out the perfect consistency for pounding the meat. This wasn't a sudden invention. It was incremental improvement over centuries. Knowledge passed down through families and communities. From experienced practitioners To those learning the craft, it was empirical science, hypothesis, experiment, observation, refinement, done without laboratories or written records, but no less rigorous for that. And it worked. It worked so well that when Europeans arrived with all their technology and their certainty in their own superiority, they immediately abandoned their own preserved foods in favor of pemmican. The native solution was simply better. That knowledge kept families alive through winters that would have killed anyone without it. It enabled trade networks spanning thousands of miles. It allowed people to thrive, not just survive, but actually thrive in environments we now consider extreme. The Great Plains in winter, the boreal forests of northern Canada, these places didn't defeat the people who lived there. Those people mastered them. Pemmican is a monument to human ingenuity, to the power of observation and experimentation, to the value of traditional knowledge, and to the incredible things people can achieve when survival demands excellence. But pemmican wasn't the only preservation triumph. Across the continent, other nations faced different challenges and created different solutions, each one equally brilliant in its own way. What happened in the Pacific Northwest, where salmon returned in numbers so vast they seemed infinite? How do you preserve thousands of pounds of fish when you live in a humid coastal climate where mold grows on everything? The nations there developed techniques that turned overwhelming abundance into year-round security. Let's find out how they did it. The Pacific Northwest presented a completely different preservation problem than the Great Plains. This wasn't a landscape of scarcity where you needed to stretch limited resources. This was a land of overwhelming abundance, and abundance created its own challenges. Every year, the salmon returned to the rivers of the Pacific Northwest in numbers that seemed impossible. Millions of fish surging upstream in waves so thick you could practically walk across their backs. The Chinook, the sockeye, the coho, the pink salmon, each species had its own run, its own timing. From spring through fall, the rivers ran silver with fish. For the coastal Salish, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Maka, the Nuchanolth, and dozens of other coastal and river nations, these salmon runs represented the foundation of life. A successful salmon season meant food security for the entire year. But here was the problem. You might catch thousands of pounds of fish in a few weeks. How do you keep it from rotting in one of the wettest, most humid climates on Earth? The solution they developed was so effective that smoked salmon from the Pacific Northwest eventually became a luxury food traded across the entire continent and later around the world. But it started as pure necessity. Communities that needed to turn temporary abundance into permanent security. To understand the preservation challenge, you need to understand the scale of the salmon runs. These weren't small catches. When the salmon returned, entire communities mobilized. Everyone had a role. The Tlingit people of southeast Alaska developed sophisticated fishing techniques for the massive runs. Then they built fish weirs, fence-like structures that channeled salmon into traps where they could be harvested efficiently. A single weir might catch hundreds of fish in a day during peak runs. Archaeological evidence suggests these weir systems were used for thousands of years, refined and improved by countless generations. The coastal Salish peoples around Puget Sound and the Strait of Georgia had reef net fishing, an ingenious system that used nets suspended between two canoes to intercept salmon traveling along predictable routes. Reef net fishing required incredible skill, coordination between the fishermen, and deep knowledge of salmon behavior and migration patterns. But when executed properly, it could harvest massive quantities of fish with minimal waste. The New Cha Nulth on Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula caught salmon in rivers using a variety of techniques: spears, nets, and traps. During the peak of the runs, a skilled fisher could catch more salmon in a single day than a family could eat in a week. This abundance was celebrated. The first salmon ceremony, practiced by many Pacific Northwest nations, honored the first salmon caught each season. The fish was ceremonially prepared, shared among the community, and its bones carefully returned to the river. This wasn't superstition. It was recognition that the salmon's return was the most important event of the year, the moment that determined whether families would eat well or go hungry in the months ahead. But ceremony alone didn't preserve fish. That required technique, knowledge, and enormous amounts of work. Smoking fish is ancient technology, practiced in various forms around the world. But the Pacific Northwest nations refined it to an art form. Their methods produced salmon that could last for months, resist mold in humid conditions, and retain nutritional value, all without refrigeration or modern preservatives. The process started immediately after the catch. Timing was critical. Fresh salmon spoils quickly, especially in the mild coastal climate. Among the Haida, experts would begin processing fish within hours of the catch. The longer you waited, the greater the risk of spoilage. First came the cleaning and butterflying. Using specialized knives traditionally made from stone or shell, later from metal obtained through trade, processors would split the salmon along the backbone, removing the guts and gills while keeping the two sides connected. The goal was to create a fish that could lay flat, maximizing surface area for smoking and drying. The butterflied salmon were then hung on racks in smokehouses. These weren't simple sheds. They were carefully designed structures that controlled smoke, heat, and airflow. The Tlingit built large communal smokehouses that could process hundreds of fish simultaneously. These buildings had adjustable vents to control smoke density, racks at different heights to manage heat exposure, and designs that prevented rain from entering while allowing smoke to escape. The wood selection mattered enormously. Alder was the gold standard across much of the Pacific Northwest. Alder smoke gave salmon a clean, slightly sweet flavor that complemented the fish's natural richness. It also burned at the right temperature, hot enough to dry the fish efficiently, but not so hot that it cooked the exterior while leaving the interior raw. Cedar was sometimes used, particularly by the Makah and other groups with abundant cedar forests. Cedar smoke had antimicrobial properties that helped prevent spoilage, but cedar was often reserved for other uses, building canoes, houses, and storage boxes, because of how valuable the wood was. The smoking process took days. This wasn't quick hot smoking like modern techniques. This was cold smoking combined with slow drying. The fish hung in the smokehouse for days or even weeks, depending on weather conditions and the desired final product. The smoke did multiple things simultaneously. It deposited compounds on the fish's surface that inhibited bacterial growth. It dried the fish gradually, reducing moisture content to levels where bacteria couldn't thrive, and it created flavor, the distinctive taste that made Pacific Northwest smoked salmon famous. But the real genius was in the control. Coastal Salish smoking experts could adjust the process to create different products. A lightly smoked salmon might be intended for consumption within weeks. Still moist, rich in oils, delicious but not shelf-stable for months. A heavily smoked, nearly jerky-like salmon would be rock-hard, nearly moisture-free, and capable of lasting through the winter and into spring. Not all preserved salmon was smoked. Pacific Northwest nations developed multiple preservation methods, each suited to different needs. Wind drying was common in areas with strong, consistent winds. The New Cha Nolth would hang butterflied salmon on racks exposed to ocean breezes. The constant airflow dried the fish, while the salt air added natural preservative qualities. Wind-dried salmon had a different texture than smoked salmon, chewier, saltier, with the ocean's flavor embedded in every bite. Some salmon was dried in the sun when weather permitted. This was trickier in the often overcast Pacific Northwest climate. But during periods of clear weather, sun drying could produce excellent results. The key was keeping insects away. Racks were often covered with woven mats that allowed airflow while preventing flies from laying eggs on the fish. Salmon strips were another common preparation. Instead of butterflying entire fish, processors would cut salmon into thin strips that dried faster than whole fish. These strips were portable, easy to store, and could be eaten as is or rehydrated in soups and stews. The Tlingit also preserved salmon eggs, the roe, that modern sushi lovers know as ikura. The roe was dried, sometimes smoked lightly, and stored in bentwood boxes. Dried salmon roe was nutrient-dense, rich in oils and protein, and highly valued for trade. While salmon got most of the attention, another fish was equally important to Pacific Northwest food security. The eulachon, also called candlefish or eulachon. Eulachon are small, oily fish that run in massive numbers in early spring, before the main salmon runs. The Tsimshian, Niska, Haisla, and other northern coastal nations harvested eulachon not primarily for the meat, though the fish were eaten fresh, but for their oil. Eulachon are so fatty that when dried they could be lit like candles, burning with their own oil, hence the name. But the real value was extracting that oil for food and preservation. The process of rendering eulachon oil was elaborate, and harvested fish were placed in large canoes or wooden containers and left to ferment slightly, not to full rot, but enough to begin breaking down the tissues. Then the fish were boiled in water. As they boiled, the oil separated and rose to the surface, where it could be carefully skimmed off. The resulting oil was pure gold. Literally, eulachon oil was called grease and was one of the most valuable trade goods in the Pacific Northwest. Trade routes that carried this oil inland were called grease trails, and some of these routes stretched hundreds of miles into the interior. Why was eulachon oil so valuable? Because fat was relatively scarce in the coastal diet. Salmon had fat, but not like the enormous concentrations found in buffalo or caribou. Eulachon oil provided concentrated calories, roughly the same calorie density as butter or lard. It could be eaten directly, mixed with dried foods to soften them and add richness, or used as a dip for dried salmon or other preserved foods. Eulachon oil was also a preservative. Food stored in eulachon oil lasted longer. The oil created an oxygen barrier similar to what buffalo fat did in pemmican. Dried berries stored in eulachon oil could last for months. The oil prevented oxidation and added calories. The Tsimshian stored eulachon oil in bentwood boxes, wooden containers made from a single plank of cedar that was steamed, bent into a box shape, and sewn or pegged together. These boxes were remarkably watertight. Oil stored in a properly made bentwood box could last for years. Speaking of bentwood boxes, the Pacific Northwest nation's mastery of cedar technology deserves recognition. Cedar wasn't just building material, it was the foundation of their entire material culture. Western red cedar grows massive in the coastal rainforests. Individual trees could reach 200 feet tall and 15 feet in diameter. The wood splits cleanly, resists rot, has natural antimicrobial properties, and is light enough to work easily. Bentwood boxes were used for everything: storing food, holding water, even cooking. Yes, cooking. A watertight bentwood box could be filled with water, and hot rocks dropped into the water would bring it to a boil, allowing you to cook fish or shellfish without metal pots. For food storage, bentwood boxes were ideal. They kept moisture out, protected contents from insects and rodents, and could be stacked efficiently. A well-made bentwood box could last for generations. Cedar planks were also used to create drying racks, smokehouse walls, and storage platforms. The natural oils in cedar repelled insects and inhibited mold growth. Food stored on cedar shelves lasted longer than food stored on other woods. Even cedar bark was useful. The inner bark could be woven into mats, baskets, and clothing. Cedar bark baskets were used to collect berries, store dried foods, and carry goods. The bark was naturally water-resistant, making it perfect for storing dried foods in the humid coastal environment. Salmon and eulachon got the glory, but Pacific Northwest peoples preserved many other foods from the sea. Clams were harvested in enormous quantities during low tides. The macaw and other coastal groups would gather hundreds of pounds of clams during minus tides. The lowest tides of the year, when usually submerged clam beds were exposed. Fresh clams spoil within hours, so preservation was essential. The clams were steamed open, removed from their shells, and threaded onto cedar sticks. These skewers of clam meat were then hung to dry, either in smokehouses or in the open air. Dried clams became chewy, intensely flavored, and shelf-stable for months. Seaweed was another crucial preserved food. Several species of kelp and seaweed were harvested along the coast. The most prized was probably nori-like seaweed that could be dried into sheets. This seaweed was incredibly nutritious, high in vitamins, minerals, and iodine. Seaweed was harvested during specific times of year when it was young and tender. It was rinsed in fresh water to remove excess salt, then spread on rocks or wooden frames to dry in the sun and wind. Once dried, it was pressed into compact cakes that could be stored in bentwood boxes or baskets. Dried seaweed had multiple uses. It could be eaten as is, crumbled into soups and stews, or reconstituted and cooked as a vegetable. It added flavor, nutrition, and variety to the winter diet when fresh greens were unavailable. All of this work, the fishing, the processing, the smoking, the drying, created something remarkable. By the end of fall, a successful Pacific Northwest household would have stores that could feed the family through the entire winter and into spring. Smoked salmon stacked in the smokehouse or stored in bentwood boxes. Dried salmon strips in baskets. Eulachon oil in watertight containers. Dried clams and seaweed. Preserved berries. These weren't poverty rations. This was abundance intentionally created and carefully stored. The winter ceremonial season was possible because of this food security. The famous potlatches of the Pacific Northwest, massive gatherings where hosts gave away enormous quantities of food and goods. were only possible because nations had preserved enough surplus to feed hundreds of guests for days or weeks. This abundance also enabled trade. Coastal nations traded preserved salmon, eulachon oil, and dried shellfish to interior nations who didn't have access to marine resources. In exchange, they received hides, furs, and foods from the mountains and forests. The preservation techniques created more than just food security. They created wealth, social structure, and interconnection across vast territories. But what about people who lived in the opposite extreme? Not the wet, abundant coast, but the scorching, arid deserts of the Southwest. If the Pacific Northwest was about managing abundance and humidity, the American Southwest was about managing scarcity in heat. Rain was scarce. Water was precious. Summer temperatures could soar above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, people not only survived, they built sophisticated civilizations with cities, trade networks, and food systems that sustained thousands. The Hopi, the Zuni, the various Puebloan peoples of the Rio Grande, the Ancestral Puebloans, who built the famous cliff dwellings, all of them solved the preservation challenge through a combination of crop selection, architectural ingenuity, and techniques refined over thousands of years. Corn was life in the Southwest. It provided the majority of calories, could be prepared in countless ways, and crucially, could be stored for years when properly dried. But not just any corn. The corn varieties grown by Hopi, Zuni, and other Southwest nations were specifically adapted for storage. These were flint corns and flour corns, varieties with hard outer shells and low moisture content even when fresh. Modern sweet corn, the kind most Americans eat, is terrible for long-term storage. It's bred for sugar content and moisture, which makes it delicious fresh, but means it spoils quickly and doesn't dry well. The corn grown by Southwest nations was the opposite, low in sugars, high in starch, with kernels that dried hard as stone. After harvest, corn was dried even further. Among the Hopi, ears of corn were hung from ceiling beams in adobe houses where they would dry for weeks. The dry desert air pulled moisture from the kernels until they became rock hard. Once fully dried, the corn could be stored for years. Archaeological excavations of ancestral Puebloan sites have found intact dried corn in storage rooms that are hundreds of years old. That corn, if it hadn't been archaeological evidence, would still be edible. The Hopi maintained seed corn separately. Special varieties kept pure for planting, never eaten even in times of scarcity. This seed corn was stored with almost religious reverence because it represented future harvests, future food security, future survival. The architecture of food storage in the Southwest was sophisticated. The Ancestral Puebloans, who built the famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and other sites, created specialized storage rooms that were masterpieces of engineering. These weren't just rooms where you dumped grain. They were carefully designed to control temperature, humidity, and access. Storage rooms were typically small, often just 6 or 8 feet across, with low ceilings and small doorways. This design minimized volume, which helped maintain stable temperatures. Hot air couldn't fill the space, and the thick adobe or stone walls provided insulation. Many storage rooms were built underground or partially underground. Subterranean storage took advantage of the Earth's natural temperature stability, while surface temperatures might swing from 100 degrees during the day to 60 degrees at night. Underground temperatures remained relatively constant. Cool but not cold, stable year-round. The rooms were sealed when full. Doorways might be plastered over or blocked with stone slabs. This kept out rodents, insects, and moisture. It also helped control access. Stored grain was valuable, and not everyone could just help themselves. Ventilation was carefully managed. Some storage rooms had small vents that allowed air circulation without letting in rain or pests. This prevented mold while maintaining the dry conditions that kept grain stable. The Hopi built stone granaries that are still standing today. These cylindrical structures, perched on mesa tops or tucked into cliff alcoves, were waterproof, insulated, and nearly indestructible. A well-built granary could protect corn for 5, 10, even 20 years. Why store corn for decades? Because drought was always a possibility. In a good year, you grew surplus and stored it. In a drought year, you survived on stored reserves. Having corn from 5 or 10 years ago meant your family didn't starve when the crops failed. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were grown together across much of the Americas. But in the Southwest, preserving all three was essential for nutritional balance. Beans dried naturally on the vine. Once the pods dried and became brittle, Zuni and Hopi families would harvest them, shell out the beans, and store them in clay pots or woven baskets. Dried beans, like dried corn, could last for years. Squash was trickier. Fresh squash contains a lot of moisture and spoils quickly. But Southwest peoples developed several preservation methods. Winter squashes, varieties with hard rinds, could be stored whole for months in cool, dry places. The thick rind protected the flesh inside, and in the stable temperature of an adobe house or storage room, these squashes lasted well into winter. For longer storage, squash was cut into strips and dried. The flesh was peeled, sliced thin, and hung to dry in the desert sun. Dried squash strips became hard and leathery but rehydrated well when cooked in stews. These strips could last a year or more. Squash seeds were also preserved. Roasted and dried, they became a nutritious snack and a source of oils and protein. Cultivated crops weren't the only preserved foods. Southwest nations harvested and preserved numerous wild foods. Piñon nuts, the seeds of piñon pine trees, were a major food source. Every few years, piñon trees would produce massive crops of nuts. When this happened, entire communities would travel to piñon groves for harvest. The nuts were collected, roasted to stop oils from going rancid, and stored in clay pots. Piñon nuts are incredibly nutritious, high in protein, fat, and calories. A family with a good store of piñon nuts had a hedge against crop failure. Mesquite pods were another crucial wild food. Mesquite trees grow across much of the Southwest, and their seed pods are edible. The pods were harvested in summer, dried, and ground into flour. Mesquite flour is naturally sweet, high in protein, and stores well. Various cactus fruits were also preserved. The fruits of prickly pear cactus were made into jams or dried into cakes. Saguaro cactus fruits, harvested by the Tohono O'odham and other southern Arizona nations, were boiled into syrup that could be stored in clay containers. Pottery was essential to Southwest food preservation. Clay pots, some small enough to hold in one hand, others large enough to hold dozens of pounds of grain, were the primary storage containers. Puebloan potters developed sophisticated techniques. Clay was sourced from specific deposits. mixed with tempering materials like crushed rock or old pottery shards to prevent cracking, and shaped into vessels that were both functional and often beautifully decorated. The pots were fired in open fires or rudimentary kilns, reaching temperatures high enough to vitrify the clay and make it watertight. A well-made pot could last for generations. Storage pots often had narrow mouths that could be sealed with a flat stone or piece of wood and then plastered over with clay. This created an airtight seal that protected the contents from moisture, insects, and rodents. Large storage jars, ollas, could hold 50 or more pounds of corn or beans. These were kept in storage rooms, often partially buried in the floor for added temperature stability. Smaller pots were used for seeds, dried herbs, and precious items like salt or rare foods obtained through trade. The combination of crop selection, architectural storage, and preservation techniques gave Southwest peoples something remarkable: multi-year food security. A Hopi family might have corn from this year's harvest, corn from 2 years ago as backup, and seed corn from varieties maintained for generations. They'd have dried beans, preserved squash, stored piñon nuts, and dried wild foods. This wasn't hand-to-mouth survival. This was intentional resilience. This food security enabled the construction of permanent settlements. You can't build multi-story apartment complexes like those at Taos Pueblo or Chaco Canyon if you're constantly moving to find food. The preserved food meant people could stay put, invest in architecture, develop complex social structures, and create art. It also enabled trade. Southwest nations traded preserved corn, dried foods, and pottery with Plains nations for buffalo products, with coastal nations for shells and marine goods, and with Mexican civilizations for items like cacao and tropical bird feathers. The preservation techniques created stability, and in the harsh Southwest environment, stability meant survival. But impressive as these techniques were, they still seem almost reasonable compared to what happened in the Arctic. How do you preserve food where it's frozen solid 6 or 8 months a year, where plants barely grow, where your entire diet is fish, marine mammals, and caribou? The Inuit and Yupik peoples of the Arctic developed solutions so brilliant, so counterintuitive, that they challenged everything early explorers thought they knew about food safety. Let's go north. Imagine trying to survive where temperatures regularly drop to 40 or 50 below zero, where winter darkness lasts for months, where nothing grows except a few hardy lichens and mosses, where your nearest tree might be hundreds of miles away, where storms can trap you inside for days or weeks at a time. Now imagine that you not only survive, you thrive. You raise families, you create art, you develop complex societies with trade networks, sophisticated tools, and rich cultural traditions. You live in the most extreme environment humans have ever permanently inhabited, and you do it without grocery stores, without imports from warmer climates, without any of the technology we consider essential for cold weather survival. This was reality for the Inuit, the Yupik, the Inupiat, and other Arctic peoples. They didn't just endure the Arctic, they mastered it so completely that European explorers who arrived with all their modern equipment, their canned goods, their certainty in their technological superiority, often died while the people they encountered lived comfortably. The key to this mastery? Food preservation techniques that seemed to violate every rule of food safety that Europeans understood. Techniques that early explorers called disgusting dangerous, impossible. Techniques that, quote, it turned out, were brilliant applications of food science that we're only now beginning to fully understand. First, understand what food meant in the Arctic. There was essentially no plant food for most of the year. No berries in winter, no edible greens, no roots to dig up from frozen ground. The diet was almost entirely animal-based: fish, seals, walrus, caribou, polar bears, whales, birds. This presented unique preservation challenges. Animal foods are high in protein and fat, both of which can spoil quickly under the wrong conditions. Bacteria love protein. Fats can go rancid when exposed to oxygen, and yet Arctic peoples needed to preserve enough food during the brief summer and fall hunting seasons to last through 8 or 9 months of winter, and they couldn't rely on heat for preservation. You can't sun-dry meat when the sun barely rises for months. Smoke preservation was difficult because driftwood was scarce and trees were non-existent in many regions. Traditional drying methods that worked in warmer climates were often impossible in the cold, damp conditions of the Arctic coast. So Arctic peoples developed techniques that used their environment's unique conditions. They worked with extreme cold rather than against it. They used natural processes that would horrify modern food safety experts, but that produced food that was not only safe, but nutritionally superior in many ways to properly preserved foods. The most obvious preservation method was freezing. When temperatures drop to 20 or 30 below zero, meat freezes solid in hours. Frozen meat doesn't spoil. Bacteria can't grow. The food is locked in time. Among the Inupiat of northern Alaska, hunters who killed caribou in late fall would sometimes leave entire carcasses where they fell, marked for later retrieval. The meat would freeze solid within a day. Weeks or months later, they'd return with dog sleds to collect the frozen meat. It would be as fresh as the day it was killed, but simple freezing had limitations. You needed consistent cold, not always guaranteed even in the Arctic, where winter temperatures could fluctuate, and frozen meat was difficult to work with. Try cutting frozen meat with stone or bone tools and you'll understand the problem. So freezing was combined with other techniques to create more versatile preserved foods. Cached meat, buried in permafrost or stored in ice cellars, took advantage of the permanently frozen ground that lies just below the surface across much of the Arctic. These natural freezers maintained temperatures around 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to preserve food indefinitely. The Inuit would dig into permafrost, creating underground chambers that functioned as walk-in freezers. Seal meat, fish, caribou, and other foods were stored in these caches, where they remained frozen year-round. Some caches were passed down through generations, with families adding to stores each year. Archaeological excavations have found ancient meat caches that are hundreds of years old, with meat still frozen and theoretically still edible. Here's where Arctic food preservation becomes truly fascinating. Fermentation, the process of controlled decomposition by bacteria, seems like the last thing you'd want in a preservation method. But Arctic peoples developed fermented foods that were not only safe, but provided crucial nutrients unavailable in frozen or dried foods. The most famous, or infamous, is fermented seal meat, known by various names, including eugachon among the Inuit. The process seems insane to outsiders. A seal is killed, butchered, and buried whole or in large pieces in a pit, or wrapped in sealskin and cached underground or under rocks. Then it's left. for months, sometimes for a year or more. During this time, the meat ferments. Bacteria break down proteins and fats, creating new compounds and flavors. The meat becomes soft, almost paste-like in texture. It develops a strong, pungent odor that early European explorers described as unbearable. And yet this fermented seal was, and still is, considered a delicacy by Arctic peoples. It was served at celebrations. It was offered to honored guests. It was prized, not merely tolerated. Why would anyone eat fermented months-old seal meat? First, because it was safe. The fermentation process, when done correctly, was controlled by specific bacteria that prevented the growth of dangerous pathogens. The cold temperatures of the Arctic slowed fermentation to a pace that favored safe bacteria over harmful ones. And the seal's own oils and the anaerobic conditions inside a sealed cache prevented the growth of most dangerous organisms. Second, because it provided nutrients that were difficult to get from other sources. Fermented foods contain enzymes and bacteria that aid digestion. They contain vitamins that are created or enhanced during fermentation, including vitamin C, the crucial nutrient that prevents scurvy. This is critical. European explorers in the Arctic frequently died of scurvy despite having preserved foods. Their salted pork, hardtack, and canned goods contained no vitamin C. After months on this diet, their gums would bleed, their teeth would fall out, old wounds would reopen, and eventually they would die. Arctic peoples eating traditional diets, including fermented foods, never got scurvy. The fermentation process preserved and even enhanced the vitamin C content of seal meat and other foods. Fermented seal wasn't just safe, it was nutritionally essential. Seal wasn't the only fermented food. Fish, particularly salmon and whitefish, were also fermented by Yupik and other groups. One preparation involved burying whole fish in pits lined with grass or leaves. The fish would be packed tightly, covered, and left to ferment for weeks or months. The resulting product was similar to fermented seal, soft, textured, strongly flavored, rich in nutrients. Another method produced fermented fish heads, a delicacy in many Arctic communities. The heads were buried separately from the bodies and fermented longer, becoming soft enough that everything, eyes, brains, cartilage, could be eaten. The oils and fats from the fish heads were highly nutritious, and the fermentation made these nutrients more bioavailable. Fermented fish eggs, salmon roe that was buried and allowed to ferment, were another valued food. The eggs became creamy and spreadable, with an intensely savory flavor. So these foods sound extreme to modern ears, but remember the context. Arctic peoples had limited food options. They needed maximum nutrition from every resource available, and they needed ways to preserve food that worked in their environment, not in some theoretical ideal preservation conditions that didn't exist at 70 degrees north latitude. Fermentation was their answer, and it worked. Modern food scientists studying traditional Arctic fermentation have discovered that it's more sophisticated than it appears. The process isn't random spoilage. It's controlled fermentation using specific bacterial strains that thrive in cold temperatures. These cold-adapted bacteria, including various lactobacillus species, create acidic conditions that prevent the growth of dangerous pathogens like botulism or E. coli. The acids they produce, primarily lactic acid, preserve the meat while breaking down proteins into more digestible forms. The low temperatures of Arctic fermentation, often just above freezing, slow the process dramatically compared to fermentation in warmer climates. Where sauerkraut might ferment in weeks, Arctic seal meat might ferment over many months. This slow fermentation produces complex flavors and preserves nutrients better than faster fermentation methods. The anaerobic conditions created by burying food or sealing it in sealskin bags prevent oxidation and the growth of aerobic bacteria that cause spoilage. Without oxygen, fats don't go rancid the way they would in exposed meat. What looked like reckless food handling to European observers was actually sophisticated microbiology developed through thousands of years of observation and experimentation. If fermented seal seems extreme, aged walrus takes it further. Among some Inuit groups, walrus meat was cached and aged for extended periods, sometimes years. The process was similar to seal fermentation, but on a larger scale. Walrus are enormous animals. Adult males can weigh over 3,000 pounds. A single walrus could provide enough meat to feed a family for months. But you couldn't eat a ton of fresh walrus meat before it spoiled. So the meat was cached, buried in permafrost pits, or stored in ice cellars where it aged slowly in near-freezing temperatures. Over months and years, the meat's texture and flavor changed. It became tender, intensely flavored, and highly prized. Aged walrus, like fermented seal, provided enzymes and bacteria that aided digestion of the high-fat Arctic diet. The aging process broke down proteins and fats into forms that were easier for the human body to process. European explorers who tasted aged walrus almost universally described it as revolting. But they were judging it by standards developed in completely different environments, with completely different nutritional needs. For Arctic peoples whose diet was almost entirely meat and fat, aged walrus wasn't just edible, it was a crucial source of nutrients and digestive aids. Fat was life in the Arctic. The human body needs enormous amounts of calories to maintain core temperature in extreme cold. A person doing moderate work in sub-zero temperatures might need 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day, double what they'd need in temperate climates. So seal oil provided those calories in the most concentrated form possible. Fat contains 9 calories per gram, more than twice the calories of protein or carbohydrates. For Arctic peoples, fat wasn't just food, it was fuel. The Inuit and Yupik rendered seal oil using methods similar to the eulachon oil rendering of the Pacific Northwest. Seal blubber, the thick layer of fat that insulates seals from cold water, was cut into pieces and rendered slowly over low heat, or allowed to render naturally in warm weather. The oil that resulted was clear, slightly golden, and incredibly nutritious. It contained not just calories, but also vitamins A and D, crucial nutrients that are scarce in Arctic environments, where sunlight is limited for much of the year. Seal oil was consumed directly, used as a dip for dried meat or fish, mixed with berries, when available, or used to soften dried foods. It was also used for lighting lamps, the famous quillic, the soapstone oil lamp that provided heat and light in Arctic homes. The oil was stored in seal bladders or intestines that had been cleaned, inflated, and dried. These containers were watertight and flexible, perfect for storing liquid. A seal bladder full of oil could last a family for weeks. While fermentation and freezing were the most distinctive Arctic preservation methods, drying was also important, though it required adapting techniques to Arctic conditions. The Yupik of southwestern Alaska dried salmon in enormous quantities. During the summer, salmon runs, entire villages would work to process thousands of fish. The salmon were split, cleaned, and hung on drying racks where wind and, when available, sun would gradually dry them. But Arctic drying was different from drying in warmer climates. The air was often humid from proximity to the ocean. Temperatures were cool, slowing the drying process. And insects, while less prevalent than in warmer regions, were still a problem during the brief Arctic summer. The solution was patience and proper airflow. Drying racks were positioned to catch prevailing winds. Fish were spaced to allow air circulation around each piece. And the process took longer, sometimes weeks instead of days. The result was dried fish that could last through the winter. When properly dried to the point of being rock hard, the fish was nearly indestructible. It could be eaten as is, softened in water, or rendered into fish meal by pounding. Some fish were lightly dried, not to complete preservation, but to a stage where they could be frozen more effectively. This semi-dried fish had better texture when thawed and cooked than fish that was frozen fresh. Some Arctic foods were preserved simply by being kept frozen and eaten raw. Maktak, whale skin with the attached blubber layer, was often consumed this way. When a whale was harvested, the maktak was cut into manageable pieces and cached in permafrost or ice cellars. Kept frozen, it remained fresh for months. When wanted, a piece would be retrieved, thawed slightly if desired, and eaten raw. To outsiders, raw whale skin sounds unappetizing. But maktak is actually quite delicious. The skin has a chewy texture similar to calamari, while the blubber layer is rich and nutty, and it's incredibly nutritious, packed with vitamins C and D, omega-3 fatty acids, and dense calories. Eating raw or frozen foods might seem primitive, but it was actually nutritionally superior in many ways to cooked foods. Cooking destroys some vitamins, particularly vitamin C. By eating foods raw or just barely thawed, Arctic peoples preserved maximum nutritional value. This was crucial in an environment where fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. The raw and lightly preserved foods provided nutrients that would have been lost with extensive processing or cooking. The physical methods of storing food in the Arctic were adapted to available materials. There were no trees for wooden boxes in most Arctic regions, no clay for pottery. Storage had to use what was available: stone, ice, snow, and animal materials. Ice cellars were dug into permafrost, creating underground rooms that maintained freezing temperatures year-round. These cellars could be surprisingly large. Some were big enough to walk into, with room for hundreds of pounds of stored food. The entrances were often covered with stone slabs or sealskin to keep out animals and maintain stable temperatures. Inside, meat and fish were stacked or hung, organized by type and age. Above-ground caches were built from stone, creating small structures that provided some protection from animals while allowing cold air to circulate. These were used for shorter-term storage, or in locations where digging was impossible due to solid rock. Sealskin bags served as flexible containers. A seal's skin could be carefully removed nearly intact, creating a natural bag. These bags were used for storing oil, fermented foods, and dried goods. The skin itself was waterproof and durable. Intestines from seals or walrus were cleaned and used as storage containers for oil or small quantities of preserved foods. These were lightweight and could be carried during travel. Even snow and ice were used for storage. In winter, a simple snowbank became a freezer. Meat could be buried in snow, which insulated it from temperature fluctuations while keeping it frozen. Arctic peoples traveled extensively. Hunting trips, trading expeditions, seasonal moves between camps. They needed preserved foods that were portable, calorie-dense, and stable under varying conditions. Dried fish and meat were obvious choices. A bundle of dried fish could provide days of food while weighing just a few pounds. The fish could be eaten without cooking, softened by soaking in water, or boiled into a soup when fuel was available. Seal oil in intestine containers provided concentrated calories that were easy to carry. A few pounds of oil could supplement dried foods and provide crucial fats. Some groups made a pemmican-like food from caribou or seal meat mixed with rendered fat and berries when available. This Arctic pemmican served the same purpose as Plains pemmican: maximum nutrition in minimum weight. Frozen raw meat was also carried on winter journeys. In sub-zero temperatures, meat stayed frozen indefinitely. Travelers could eat it frozen or build a small fire to thaw and cook it. The portability of preserved foods enabled the extensive travel that Arctic life required. Hunters might travel for days or weeks following caribou herds or searching for seals. Without lightweight, preserved foods, such journeys would have been impossible. Modern nutritional science reveals just how well-designed the traditional Arctic diet was. Despite consisting almost entirely of animal foods, a diet that sounds unbalanced and unhealthy to modern ears, it provided complete nutrition. The combination of frozen, fermented, dried, and raw foods ensured a wide range of nutrients. Frozen raw meat preserved vitamin C. Fermented foods provided B vitamins and aided digestion. Seal oil supplied vitamins A and D, organs, liver, kidneys, heart, provided iron, minerals, and vitamins that muscle meat lacked. The high fat content of the diet was perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions. Fat provided the enormous calorie requirements for cold weather living. It supplied steady energy without the blood sugar spikes of carbohydrate-heavy diets, and it aided the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. Studies of traditional Arctic diets showed that people eating this way had remarkably good health: strong bones, healthy teeth, low rates of heart disease, and excellent physical endurance. The diet that European observers called primitive and unbalanced was actually sophisticated and nutritionally complete. The Arctic ruthlessly punished ignorance. Make a mistake in food preservation and your family starves. Fail to cache enough food and you don't survive the winter. Choose the wrong storage method and your food spoils. But Arctic peoples weren't surviving by luck. They were surviving because they had refined their preservation techniques over thousands of years. Every method had been tested through countless iterations. Every technique had been passed down from elders to younger generations, accompanied by the knowledge of why it worked, when to apply it, and what could go wrong. This knowledge was as essential to survival as hunting skills or the ability to build shelter. A great hunter who didn't know how to preserve his catch would still starve. But families with deep knowledge of preservation techniques could weather bad hunting seasons, harsh winters, and unexpected challenges. The famous Franklin expedition of 1845, British ships attempting to navigate the Northwest Passage, illustrates this starkly. The expedition was equipped with cutting-edge technology, canned foods, and every advantage Victorian Britain could provide. All 129 men died, many from starvation and scurvy. Meanwhile, Inuit families living in the same region survived comfortably using traditional methods. The difference wasn't courage or determination. The British sailors had plenty of both. The difference was knowledge. The Inuit knew how to preserve food in Arctic conditions. The British didn't. When some Franklin survivors encountered Inuit and were offered preserved seal meat, they refused it, considering it disgusting and unsafe. They died eating their leather boots, while nutritious food was available if they'd been willing to trust indigenous knowledge. Today, traditional Arctic preservation techniques face challenges. Climate change is making ice cellars less reliable as permafrost thaws. Many Arctic communities now have access to grocery stores with imported foods, reducing the necessity of traditional preservation. And the knowledge itself is at risk. Fewer young people are learning techniques that were once universally known, but there's also a revival of interest. Many Arctic communities are working to preserve traditional food knowledge, recognizing that it represents thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Elders teach younger generations how to ferment seal, how to properly cache meat, how to judge when fermentation is complete and when it's spoiled. This knowledge has value beyond nostalgia. Traditional foods are nutritionally superior to many imported foods available in Arctic stores. They're culturally important, connecting people to their heritage, and they provide food security in regions where imported food is expensive and supply chains are fragile. Some Inuit and Yupik communities have created food programs that combine traditional preservation with modern food safety testing, ensuring that fermented and preserved foods are made safely while maintaining traditional methods and flavors. Arctic food preservation represents human adaptation at its most extreme. These techniques didn't just allow survival, they enabled thriving in conditions that would kill unprepared people within days. The genius wasn't just in the techniques themselves, though those were brilliant. It was in the observation, the experimentation, the willingness to try methods that seemed counterintuitive. Who first decided to bury seal meat and leave it for months? What made them think that would be safe rather than deadly? And after that first experiment, how many generations refined the technique, learning the right conditions, the right timing, the signs of successful fermentation versus dangerous spoilage? This was science without laboratories, hypothesis and experimentation without written records, peer review by community survival. If your preservation technique failed, people died, and that technique was abandoned. If it worked, it was passed down and refined. The result was a food system so effective that it sustained entire peoples in the harshest environment on Earth. Not just sustained, allowed them to create art, develop complex cultures, raise healthy children, and live full lives. That's not primitive survival. That's mastery. But Arctic preservation was adapted to one specific environment. Other environments, other challenges required different solutions. What about people who weren't permanently settled, who moved frequently following game or seasonal resources? They needed preservation techniques that were lightweight, portable, and stable under varying conditions. Let's explore how mobility shaped preservation across the continent. The preservation techniques we've explored so far, pemmican, smoked salmon, underground granaries, fermented seal, were primarily designed for stationary or semi-stationary communities. You made these foods, you stored them, and you consumed them over months in the same location. But not everyone lived this way. Many nations moved seasonally, following game animals, visiting different resource areas as foods became available, or traveling to trading centers and ceremonial gatherings. For these mobile peoples, preservation needed an additional quality beyond longevity and nutrition. Portability. Food had to be lightweight, it had to be compact. It had to remain stable through temperature changes as you traveled from one climate zone to another. It couldn't require special storage containers that were heavy or fragile, and ideally it needed to be ready to eat without cooking, because building fires during travel could be dangerous, time-consuming, or impossible in some conditions. Across North America, different nations developed portable preserved foods that met these requirements. Some we've already touched on. Pemmican was the ultimate portable food. But there were many others, each adapted to available resources and specific needs. Dried meat, what we generically call jerky today, was produced by nearly every nation that hunted large game. But the specifics varied enormously by region, available animals, and cultural preferences. On the Great Plains, Lakota and other buffalo hunting nations produced jerky from buffalo meat as part of their post-hunt processing. The meat was sliced thin, about a quarter-inch thick, and hung on racks to dry in sun and wind. The hot, dry plains climate was ideal for this. Meat could be fully dried in just a few days. Plains jerky was typically made without salt. Salt wasn't readily available on the interior plains, and it wasn't necessary. Complete drying, reducing moisture content to below 20%, was sufficient to prevent bacterial growth. The dried meat became hard, almost brittle, and would last for months when stored in parfleches or other containers. This jerky could be eaten as is, though it required serious chewing. More commonly, it was softened by soaking in water or added to stews where it would rehydrate and add flavor and protein. In the eastern woodlands, nations like the Haudenosaunee made jerky from deer and elk. The process was similar to plains jerky, but the more humid climate made drying slower and more challenging. Smoke was often used more heavily, not just to keep insects away, but to add preservative compounds that helped prevent mold in humid conditions. Haudenosaunee jerky often incorporated smoke from specific woods. Hickory was prized for the flavor it imparted. The smoking wasn't about cooking the meat, but about depositing antimicrobial compounds on the surface and adding flavor that made the dried meat more palatable. Along the northwest coast, where we've already discussed salmon preservation, jerky was also made from land animals, deer, elk, and mountain goat. The challenge was the humid coastal climate. Meat wouldn't dry properly in open air along the coast, so smokehouses were essential. The jerky was more heavily smoked than plains versions, almost to the point of being hard as wood. In the Southwest, Apache and other groups made jerky from deer and antelope. The extremely dry desert air was excellent for drying, but the intense heat presented challenges. Meat had to be dried in shade or partial shade to prevent the exterior from cooking while the interior remained moist. The result was jerky that dried quickly and completely, producing a product that could last for a year or more in the arid climate. What made jerky universally valuable was its simplicity and reliability. You didn't need special equipment or rare ingredients. If you had meat and a way to dry it, you could make jerky. And once made, it was incredibly portable. A pound of jerky provided substantial protein in a package that weighed almost nothing and took up minimal space. Berries were seasonal treasures across much of North America. When they ripened, often in massive quantities all at once, communities would harvest as much as possible. But fresh berries spoil within days. Drying them was essential for preserving this source of vitamins, sugars, and flavor. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region harvested blueberries in enormous quantities. When the berries ripened in midsummer, entire families would travel to known blueberry patches, sometimes burned deliberately in previous years to encourage berry growth. They'd spend days picking, filling birch bark containers with pounds and pounds of berries. Fresh berries were eaten immediately, of course, but the majority were dried for winter use. The berries were spread on birch bark sheets or woven mats and left in the sun. The small berries dried quickly, becoming shriveled but still sweet. Dried blueberries could be stored in birch bark containers or leather bags for months. Dried berries were used in multiple ways. They were eaten as snacks. They were added to pemmican. They were mixed into cornmeal cakes. They were rehydrated and cooked into sauces. And they provided crucial vitamins during winter when fresh plant foods were unavailable. Choke cherries, common across much of the interior, were processed slightly differently by plains and prairie nations. The cherries were mashed, pits and all, and formed into cakes that were dried in the sun. These dried choke cherry cakes were dense, tangy, and portable. They could be broken into pieces and eaten or rehydrated and used in cooking. Saskatoon berries, similar to blueberries but slightly larger, were dried by multiple nations across the northern plains and forests. Cree families would gather them in summer, dry them thoroughly, and store them in bags for winter use. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon berries and huckleberries were dried, though the humid climate made this more challenging. Drying often happened near fires or in smokehouses, where the warmth and smoke helped remove moisture more quickly than open-air drying. The Southwest nations dried various wild fruits as well. Prickly pear fruits were dried whole or mashed into cakes. The dried fruits were incredibly sweet due to concentrated sugars and could last for years in the dry climate. Wild rice wasn't actually rice. It's the seed of an aquatic grass that grows in shallow lakes and slow-moving rivers across the Great Lakes region and into the northern plains. But for the Ojibwe, Menominee, whose name literally means wild rice people, and other nations in the region, it was a staple food as important as corn was to the Southwest. Harvesting wild rice was a specialized skill. It happened in late summer or early fall when the seeds were ripe. Harvesters worked from canoes using wooden sticks to bend the rice stalks over the canoe and knock the seeds loose. The ripe seeds fell into the canoe while unripe seeds remained on the stalk for later harvest. A good harvester could fill a canoe with rice in a few hours. But fresh wild rice couldn't be stored. It needed processing. The first step was parching. The rice was heated in shallow pans or on hot stones, enough to dry the outer hulls and make them brittle, but not enough to cook the rice inside. This parching stopped any sprouting or spoilage and made the next step possible. After parching, the rice was threshed. Traditionally, this was done by placing the rice in a shallow pit lined with hide and then dancing or treading on it with moccasin-covered feet. The motion broke away the hulls, while the soft moccasins didn't damage the rice kernels themselves. The rice was then winnowed. tossed in the air on birch bark trays so the wind would blow away the light hulls while the heavier rice kernels fell back into the container. The result was clean, dried wild rice that could be stored for years. Menominee and Ojibwe families would store wild rice in birch bark containers called makak. These containers were waterproof and kept the rice dry. A good harvest could provide hundreds of pounds of rice, enough to last until the next harvest, with plenty for trade. Wild rice was portable and lightweight. A small bag of wild rice could feed a person for days. It required cooking, boiling in water until tender, but the rice itself was shelf-stable and easy to transport. Hunters, traders, and travelers routinely carried wild rice as travel food. The nutritional value was substantial. Wild rice is high in protein compared to cultivated grains, rich in minerals, and provides sustained energy. Combined with dried meat or fish, it created a complete meal in the eastern woodlands. From the Great Lakes south through New England and into the Appalachians, maple trees provided an early spring resource, sap that could be processed into sugar. The Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Wabanaki, and other nations tapped maple trees in late winter or early spring when temperatures fluctuated above and below freezing. These temperature swings caused sap to flow up from the roots. By drilling holes in the tree and inserting hollow reeds or carved spouts, they could collect the sap in birch bark containers. Fresh maple sap is mostly water, with only about 2% sugar. To create concentrated maple syrup or sugar, enormous quantities of sap had to be boiled down. It took roughly 40 gallons of sap to produce 1 gallon of syrup. The boiling was done in large containers, later in metal kettles obtained through trade, but originally in clay pots or wooden vessels where hot stones were dropped in to heat the liquid. The sap was boiled for hours, sometimes days, until it reduced to thick syrup or crystallized into sugar. Maple sugar, solid crystallized maple sugar, was the most portable form. It could be broken into chunks or ground into granules and stored in birch bark containers. Unlike syrup, it didn't leak or spill. It was lightweight and incredibly sweet. A little went a long way. Maple sugar was used to sweeten corn dishes, added to teas, mixed with dried berries, or eaten as candy. It was also a valuable trade good, carried to nations outside maple territory and exchanged for items not available in the forests. The sugar-making season was a time of community gathering. Families would move to sugar bush camps, areas with high concentrations of maple trees, and spend weeks processing sap. The resulting sugar and syrup represented one of the few sources of concentrated sweetness available to woodland peoples. In the Plateau region, what's now eastern Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and western Montana, the Nez Perce, Yakima, Umatilla, and other nations harvested camas bulbs as a major food source. Camas is a plant with beautiful blue flowers that grows in wet meadows. Below ground, it produces bulbs that, when properly processed, are sweet and nutritious. But camas required careful identification. There's a poisonous plant called death camas that looks similar. Knowledge of which plants were safe was literally life-saving information. Harvesting happened in late spring or early summer after the plants flowered, making identification certain. Women would use digging sticks to extract the bulbs from the often muddy ground. A good harvester could collect many pounds in a day. Fresh camas bulbs are indigestible. They contain inulin, a complex carbohydrate humans can't break down. But slow cooking transforms the inulin into digestible sugars, making the bulbs sweet and nutritious. The traditional cooking method was pit roasting. A pit was dug and lined with stones. A fire was built in the pit and allowed to burn until the stones were extremely hot. The coals were then covered with wet grass or leaves. The camas bulbs were piled in, more wet vegetation was added as a layer, and the whole pit was covered with earth. The bulbs would steam in this underground oven for 1 to 3 days. The resulting cooked camas was sweet, brown, and soft. Some was eaten fresh, but much of it was formed into cakes and dried for storage. Dried camas cakes could last for years. They were portable, nutritious, and could be eaten as is or rehydrated and cooked. Camas was so important that nations fought over access to prime camas meadows. Some meadows were carefully managed, burned periodically to reduce competing plants and encourage camas growth. This wasn't wilderness. This was agriculture, though not in the European sense of plowing and planting. It was landscape management that increased food production through careful stewardship. All of these portable foods, jerky, dried berries, wild rice, maple sugar, dried camas, enabled mobility. And mobility was essential to life across much of North America. Seasonal rounds were common across the continent. A family or community might winter in one location, move to fishing sites in spring, travel to berry patches in summer, hunt in particular areas in fall, and return to winter camps. Each move required carrying food, both the preserved foods you'd made at previous locations and whatever you'd need for the journey itself. Trade required portability. The extensive trade networks that connected the Pacific coast to the Great Plains, the Southwest to the Great Lakes, were only possible because preserved foods could travel. Dried salmon from the Columbia River reached the interior plains. Pemmican from the northern plains was traded south. Shells from the Gulf Coast reached the Great Lakes. Every trading expedition required portable food to sustain the traders on their journey. Hunting expeditions could last weeks or months. Lakota buffalo hunts, Inuit caribou hunts, Haudenosaunee deer hunts, all required hunters to travel far from their camps, sometimes for extended periods. They needed food that was lightweight, nutritious, and wouldn't spoil. Social and ceremonial gatherings brought together people from vast territories. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council meetings, Pacific Northwest potlatches, plain sun dances, these gatherings might attract hundreds or thousands of people. Everyone needed to bring food, both to sustain themselves and to contribute to communal feasts. Portable preserved foods made these gatherings possible. Even warfare required portable foods. War parties traveled fast and couldn't always stop to hunt. They needed rations that were lightweight and ready to eat. Pemmican and jerky were war foods as much as they were travel foods. In short, portable preserved foods enabled the social, economic, and political connections that tied together the diverse peoples of North America. Without these foods, communities would have been isolated, trade would have been impossible, and the continent's history would have been fundamentally different. We've traveled across North America, from the scorching southwest deserts to the frozen Arctic, from the humid Pacific Northwest to the windswept Great Plains. We've seen an incredible diversity of preservation techniques, each adapted to specific environments and resources. But looking across all these methods, certain principles emerge, the common threads that connected all successful food preservation, regardless of location or culture. First, moisture removal, whether through sun drying, wind drying, smoking, or freezing. Reducing moisture was essential. Bacteria need water to grow. Remove the water and food becomes stable. This principle applied to plains jerky, Pacific Northwest salmon, Southwest corn, and Arctic dried fish. Second, temperature control. Cold slowed or stopped bacterial growth. Hot destroyed bacteria and drove off moisture. The specific temperatures varied, smoking salmon, freezing seal meat, drying corn in desert heat. But controlling temperature was always crucial. Third, oxygen exclusion. Fat in pemmican, oil covering preserved berries, sealed storage containers, all worked by keeping oxygen away from food. Without oxygen, fats don't go rancid and oxidation can't spoil food. Fourth, using beneficial processes. Fermentation wasn't spoilage. It was controlled decomposition using bacteria that made food safe and nutritious. Smoking didn't just dry meat, it deposited antimicrobial compounds. These processes improved food rather than just preserving it. Fifth, working with the environment. Arctic peoples used extreme cold. Pacific Northwest nations used constant smoke in humid climates. Southwest peoples used dry heat and underground temperature stability. Nobody fought against their environment. They used its unique characteristics to enable preservation. And finally, knowledge accumulated over generations. None of these techniques appeared fully formed. Each represented hundreds or thousands of years of observation, experiment, refinement. Each represented countless people trying variations, learning from failures, improving on successes, and passing knowledge to the next generation. In our modern world of refrigeration and supermarkets, most of these preservation techniques have disappeared from daily life. We've gained convenience but lost something valuable in the process. We've lost the knowledge of how to preserve food without electricity. If the power grid fails, most modern people would lose all their refrigerated and frozen food within days. But someone who knew how to smoke fish, dry meat, or ferment vegetables could preserve food indefinitely. We've lost the connection to our food. Modern preservation is invisible. It happens in factories with additives and processes we don't understand. Traditional preservation required intimate knowledge of food, how it changed, what made it safe, when it was ready. That knowledge created respect for food and the work required to produce it. We've lost nutritional wisdom. Many traditional preservation techniques actually improved nutrition. Fermentation created vitamins and aided digestion. Drying concentrated nutrients. Combining different preserved foods created balanced diets. Modern processed foods often do the opposite, removing nutrients and adding empty calories. We've lost resilience. Communities that could preserve their own food were self-sufficient. They weren't dependent on supply chains, grocery stores, or external systems. If a disaster struck, they had months or years of food stored. Modern societies are often just a few days away from empty store shelves if distribution systems fail. We've lost cultural connections. Food preservation was often communal, families working together to process salmon, groups harvesting wild rice, communities gathering for maple sugaring. These activities built social bonds and passed down knowledge. Modern preservation is individualized and commercial, removing those community connections. But this knowledge isn't entirely lost. Many indigenous communities are actively preserving and teaching traditional food knowledge. And increasingly, non-indigenous people are rediscovering these techniques and recognizing their value. The modern homesteading movement has embraced traditional preservation. People are learning to smoke meat, ferment vegetables, dry herbs, and store root vegetables without refrigeration. They're discovering that these old methods still work, often better than modern alternatives. The preparedness community has recognized that traditional preserved foods are superior to most modern emergency rations. Pemmican, jerky, and dried vegetables don't require electricity, don't expire quickly, and provide real nutrition. The sustainability movement sees traditional preservation as a way to reduce food waste and energy use. Why run a freezer year-round when you could dry or ferment foods instead? Why accept the environmental cost of industrial food processing when local, traditional methods work? And increasingly, people are recognizing the pure quality of traditionally preserved foods. Artisanal smoked salmon, craft fermented vegetables, traditionally cured meats. These aren't just functional foods, they're delicious. The flavors and textures created by traditional methods often surpass anything mass production can achieve. This reclamation isn't about rejecting modernity or romanticizing the past. It's about recognizing that thousands of years of human experimentation produced real wisdom that still has value. It's about maintaining knowledge that might be crucial if modern systems fail. And it's about respecting the ingenuity of the people who developed these techniques. Ultimately, this isn't just a story about food, it's a story about human beings facing seemingly impossible challenges and finding solutions. It's about Cree women pounding dried meat for hours, creating pemmican that would feed their families through brutal winters. It's about Tlingit communities working together to harvest and smoke thousands of salmon, turning a few weeks of abundance into year-round security. It's about Hopi farmers carefully selecting seed corn and storing it in underground granaries that protected against drought and famine. It's about Inuit elders teaching young people which fermented seal was safe and nutritious, knowledge that prevented scurvy and starvation. It's about thousands of years of people observing, experimenting, failing, trying again, and gradually accumulating the knowledge that allowed them to thrive in every environment this continent offered. These weren't primitive survival techniques. They were sophisticated applications of food science developed without laboratories or written records, but no less rigorous for that. They worked because they had to work. Failure meant death. The people who developed these techniques deserve our respect and recognition. Their ingenuity enabled not just survival, but flourishing cultures, complex societies, and rich traditions. The preservation methods they created were foundations, the essential technology that allowed everything else to develop. And that knowledge still matters. In a world facing climate change, supply chain disruptions, and uncertainty about future food security, the wisdom embedded in traditional preservation techniques might be more relevant than ever. We can learn from this. We can adapt these principles to modern contexts. We can preserve this knowledge, both out of respect for the people who developed it and because we might desperately need it someday. Food preservation allowed people to master every environment on this continent. From the driest deserts to the coldest tundras, from humid rainforests to windswept plains, human beings found ways not just to survive, but to build lives, raise families, create beauty, and thrive. That's not just historical fact, that's inspiration. That's evidence of what humans can achieve when necessity demands excellence and knowledge is valued and preserved. The next time you open your refrigerator without thinking about it, remember, your ancestors, all of our ancestors, preserved food without electricity, without modern chemistry, without any of the conveniences we take for granted. They did it through observation, experimentation, community knowledge, and sheer determination. They fed themselves and their children. They built trade networks. They sustained entire civilizations. They passed their knowledge down through generations. And they created food that, in many cases, was superior to what we produce today with all our technology. That's worth remembering. That's worth respecting. And that's worth preserving for the future.